In 2560 BCE, on the Giza Plateau outside modern Cairo, tens of thousands of Egyptian laborers were hauling limestone blocks weighing as much as 80 tons apiece, stacking them into what would become the Great Pyramid, the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu. 2,000 years later, the Greek historian Herodotus traveled to Egypt and asked the priests there how such a thing had ever been built. They told him something strange. They said an inscription near the pyramid's entrance recorded exactly how much silver had been spent feeding the workforce, and the ingredients named were not bread, not beer, not meat: radishes, onions, and garlic. 1,600 talents of silver, they told him, roughly 50 tons of it, spent keeping laborers supplied with a handful of pungent vegetables. Modern historians doubt almost every detail of that story, and we will get to why. But here is what nobody doubts. Somewhere in the historical record of Egypt, real laborers feeding on real rations that almost certainly included garlic did something that gets left out of the pyramid documentaries entirely. They stopped working. They crossed the checkpoints of a royal work site, sat down, and refused to move until they were fed. Historians now recognize it as one of the earliest labor strikes ever recorded in writing, thousands of years before the word union existed. And it may have started, at least in part, over a shortage of the very bulb most of us keep in a mesh bag on the kitchen counter, a plant you can buy today for around $3. So how did a small, sharp-smelling bulb become valuable enough that ancient workers were willing to risk punishment from a pharaoh's government to keep it in their rations? This story does not start in Egypt at all. It starts almost 6,000 years earlier in the mountains of Central Asia, in a place most people could not find on a map. The wild ancestor of garlic grew and still grows today across the rocky slopes of the Tian Shan Mountains, a range that stretches through what is now Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and western China. Botanists call the wild species Allium longicuspis, and it looked nothing like the neat white bulbs sold in grocery stores now. It was smaller, more irregular, growing wild among grasses at high altitude, its cloves fused unevenly, its flavor sharper and more unpredictable than any cultivated garlic today. Nobody knows exactly which group of foragers first pulled one of these bulbs out of the ground, crushed it between their fingers, and decided it was worth eating rather than avoiding. They did not know the word allicin, the sulfur compound responsible for garlic's smell and its bite, released only when the plant's cells are damaged. They had no idea they were interacting with a chemical defense system the plant had evolved specifically to punish animals for eating it. They just noticed something. It kept meat from spoiling as quickly. It seemed to settle the stomach. It gave a burst of heat and energy that plain roots did not. Over generations, without any concept of genetics, without writing, without formal agriculture yet, communities across Central Asia began selecting the bulbs that split easily into cloves, that stored the longest, that tasted the strongest. That is domestication. That is thousands of years of trial, error, and taste testing, compressed into wild plants slowly becoming a crop, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, long before the first cities existed anywhere on Earth. Think about what that actually required. There was no laboratory, no controlled breeding program, no written record of which bulb produced which offspring. There was only patience, close observation, and generation after generation of foragers who noticed, in a way we would now call empirical, which plants survived the winter, which ones split into cloves cleanly enough to replant, and which ones bit back hardest against the mouth. Early foraging communities across the region also appear to have understood, long before anyone could explain why, that crushing or chopping the bulb before eating it changed its effect, releasing a sharper smell and a stronger bite than simply biting into a whole clove. That is an early unrecorded encounter with the same chemistry Louis Pasteur would formally document thousands of years later. Storage. That storage quality mattered more than almost anything else in the ancient world. In a landscape without refrigeration, without canning, without any reliable way to preserve food through a long winter or a failed harvest, a bulb that could sit in a dry room for months without rotting was not a luxury. It was survival. Grain could be eaten by insects, meat spoiled within days without salting or smoking. Garlic, dried properly, simply sat there, viable and useful, for the better part of a year. That single property, more than flavor, more than any medicinal belief, is very likely what pushed early Central Asian communities to keep selecting for it, trading it, and eventually carrying it with them as they moved. From there, garlic began to move, carried along early trade paths west into Mesopotamia and south into the Indian subcontinent, and it did so with a kind of speed that few other plants of its era managed, mostly because it required no elaborate processing, no refining, no fermenting, no complicated preparation. Pull it up, let it dry, plant a clove, and in a matter of months you had more. That portability made it one of the easiest crops in the ancient world to carry across a mountain pass or load onto a cart, and it explains why, by the time Egypt's Old Kingdom was rising along the Nile, garlic was already a familiar plant thousands of miles from where it had first grown wild. This is where the story becomes Egyptian, and where it stops being simply a story about food. In ancient Egypt, garlic was not treated as a background ingredient. It was treated as something closer to medicine, currency, and protection all at once. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dated to roughly 1550 BCE, and one of the oldest surviving pharmacological documents in human history, lists more than 20 different remedies involving garlic, prescribed for everything from headaches to heart problems to intestinal parasites. Whole garlic bulbs, dried and intact, have been found among the burial goods in the tomb of Tutankhamun, sealed in with him for roughly 3,300 years, apparently considered valuable enough to accompany a king into the afterlife. And garlic was not reserved for royalty. It was, above almost anything else, food for the people doing the hardest physical labor in the kingdom, especially the men building the pyramids and the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. This was not a marginal food item for Egyptians of any class. Egyptians were, according to multiple ancient sources, known to swear oaths on garlic and onions the way other cultures swore on sacred texts or holy sites, treating the bulbs as objects worth invoking in a legal or religious sense. Priests in certain cults reportedly avoided garlic entirely, considering its smell impure for temple service, even as it was simultaneously prescribed by physicians as medicine and packed into royal tombs as a grave good. That contradiction, sacred enough to bury with a king, impure enough to bar from some temples, unremarkable enough to feed to common laborers by the sackful, tells you that garlic in ancient Egypt occupied an unusually complicated cultural position, valuable across every level of society at once, but valued for entirely different reasons depending on who was doing the valuing. Here is the detail that makes this strange and that historians still argue about. Herodotus, writing around 450 BCE, claimed the Great Pyramid's builders were fed enormous quantities of radishes, onions, and garlic at a cost of 1,600 talents of silver, a figure he said he read on an inscription translated for him by Egyptian priests. Now, historians debate whether this actually happened as described, and most conclude it almost certainly did not, at least not in that form. Nobody alive in Herodotus's time could reliably read hieroglyphics from 2,000 years earlier, and modern Egyptologists believe the priests who guided him around either misread a fragmentary inscription or, more likely, simply told a curious foreign tourist an entertaining story and let him believe it was history. Whether every detail of Herodotus's account is accurate remains debated among scholars. But the fact that this story has survived for 2,500 years, repeated in book after book, tells you something about how deeply garlic was already associated with the labor force of ancient Egypt, even in myth. But there is a version of this story that is not myth, and it comes from a different pharaoh entirely, roughly 1,400 years after the Great Pyramid was completed. In the 29th year of the reign of Ramesses III, around 1157 BCE, The specialized artisans who built and decorated royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings lived in a purpose-built village called Deir el-Medina. These were not the anonymous masses of Herodotus's imagination. They were skilled, literate craftsmen, paid not in coin but in rations, chiefly grain, along with vegetables, oil, meat, and fish, delivered on a regular schedule by the state. And in that 29th year, the deliveries stopped arriving on time. A scribe named Amenacht recorded what happened next on a document now known as the Turin Strike Papyrus, held today in the Egyptian Museum of Turin, and it survives as one of the most remarkable labor documents in the ancient world. On the 10th day of the second month, 18 days after their rations were due, the workmen walked past the checkpoints of the royal necropolis, something they were never supposed to do, and sat down behind the mortuary temple of Thutmoses III. According to the papyrus, they shouted, "We are hungry!" They refused to return to work. Local officials tried to talk them down. The workers held their position. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected from a civilization we usually picture as rigidly obedient to divine kings. The strike did not end quietly. It repeated again and again over the following weeks, the workers marching to different temples, staging what were effectively sit-ins, demanding not just their overdue grain, but the full range of rations they were owed, including the vegetables, oil, and fish that were part of their standard pay. Garlic and onion, staples of the Egyptian diet at every social level and a documented part of laborer rations throughout this period, would have been exactly the kind of provision on that list. Eventually, officials scrambled together emergency grain from nearby temple storehouses just to make the immediate crisis go away. It did not solve the underlying problem. Strikes at Deir el-Medina recurred intermittently for the rest of Ramses III's reign and into the reigns that followed him. Historians now consider this the earliest labor strike preserved in written record anywhere in the world, thousands of years before the concept of organized labor had any name at all. Think about that for a second. Long before pyramids became postcards, long before Egypt became a byword for ancient wonder, the actual human beings doing the building were tracking their food deliveries closely enough and valuing them enough to walk off the job when the state failed to deliver. This was not about seasoning food. Rations were wages, and a civilization capable of raising stone monuments that still stand 5,000 years later could not always manage to keep a warehouse of onions and garlic stocked on schedule. That gap between the grandeur of the monument and the fragility of the system that fed the men who built it is the real story hiding underneath Herodotus's half-invented inscription. Garlic did not stay confined to Egypt or Central Asia for long. This is where the story of garlic gets bigger than one kingdom on one river. In ancient Greece, physicians, including Hippocrates, prescribed garlic for dozens of conditions, and athletes competing in the earliest Olympic Games reportedly ate it before competition, believing it boosted stamina and aggression, essentially the ancient equivalent of a pre-workout supplement. Soldiers ate it too. Roman legionaries, according to the naturalist Pliny the Elder, were fed garlic specifically because it was believed to instill courage before battle, and Roman farmers planted it widely enough that it became one of the most common crops in the empire's fields. But here is the twist. While Roman soldiers and laborers ate garlic constantly, much of the Roman aristocracy considered it beneath them, a food for the poor, for soldiers, for people who worked outdoors and smelled like it. The philosopher Horace called it more poisonous than hemlock, complaining bitterly about a meal a friend had subjected him to. This class divide around garlic, food for the strong and the poor, avoided by the refined and the wealthy, would echo for the next 2,000 years in country after country, almost without exception. Consider that for a second, because it is a pattern that shows up again and again with foods tied to hard physical labor. Something eaten out of necessity by soldiers and farmhands, something that keeps a working body fueled through a long day, gets coded as low, coarse, unrefined, while people with the wealth to avoid strong flavors and stronger smells treat that same food with suspicion or outright disgust. Garlic breath became, across multiple centuries and multiple countries, a kind of unofficial class marker, a smell you were not supposed to bring into polite company if you wanted to be mistaken for someone who did not work with their hands. Roman etiquette writers occasionally warned against eating garlic before appearing in the presence of the wealthy, not because anyone believed it was dangerous, but because the smell itself was treated as a social liability, a tell that gave away exactly what kind of dinner and what kind of life a person was used to.
Meanwhile, halfway around the world, garlic was taking a completely different cultural path. In India, garlic became deeply embedded in Ayurvedic medicine, prescribed for joint pain, digestion, and heart health in texts dating back well over 2,000 years, even as some religious and dietary traditions restricted or avoided it, considering its pungency disruptive to a calm mind. In China, garlic spread along trade networks that would later become part of what we now call the Silk Road, and by the time of the Han Dynasty, it was cultivated widely enough to become a staple ingredient across huge portions of the population, a role it has never really given up. China today is not incidental to this story. Pay attention to that thread because it comes back later, and it comes back in a very big way. Back in Europe, a very different kind of relationship with garlic was forming, one built as much on superstition and fear as on flavor. Through the medieval period, garlic acquired a reputation as protection against evil in dozens of European folk traditions. Worn, hung, or eaten to ward off illness, misfortune, and eventually, most famously, vampires. That association did not come from ancient folklore the way people often assume. It was largely popularized far later, crystallized for a mass audience by Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, in which garlic flowers repel the count, a detail Stoker likely drew from earlier Eastern European folk beliefs about garlic's protective power against disease and evil spirits, beliefs that existed well before his book, but that his novel then broadcast to the entire English-speaking world. And no, that is not something anyone made up for entertainment. Garlic genuinely was believed across parts of Central and Eastern Europe to guard against plague, illness, and malevolent spirits, worn around the neck or hung above doorways in households that had no other defense against diseases they did not understand. In a world without germ theory, without any concept of bacteria or viruses, a plant that visibly seemed to keep meat from spoiling and seemed to ward off illness in those who ate it regularly looked, reasonably enough, like something closer to magic than medicine. It would take centuries and one specific French scientist to explain why garlic actually behaved the way it did. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the story of garlic is about to take a much darker turn than anything involving vampires. The turning point that finally moved garlic from folk superstition to documented science came in 1858, when the French chemist Louis Pasteur, already deep into the research that would eventually give the world germ theory and pasteurization, ran a series of experiments on garlic's ability to kill bacteria. He found that garlic extract genuinely did inhibit the growth of certain microorganisms, giving scientific weight to a belief that had circulated in folk medicine for thousands of years without any chemical explanation behind it. This is the part that does not get enough credit. An unglamorous kitchen bulb, dismissed by Roman aristocrats and blamed for warding off fictional monsters, turned out to have a genuine, measurable antibacterial property. One that would matter enormously less than a century later, when the world ran short of something far more modern. During both World War I and World War II, and especially on the Eastern Front during World War II, garlic was used by military medics, most famously Soviet field doctors, as an emergency antiseptic for wounds when manufactured antibiotics like penicillin were scarce or entirely unavailable. It earned the nickname Russian penicillin among soldiers who had nothing else to pack into an open wound and knew, even without a laboratory nearby, that garlic at least seemed to help. Whether every claim made about its wartime effectiveness holds up to modern clinical standards remains debated, but the practice itself, garlic as battlefield medicine in the 20th century, is extensively documented. Think about that.
A bulb first domesticated by anonymous foragers in the mountains of Central Asia 6,000 years earlier was still being pressed into open wounds on the front lines of the deadliest war in human history.
Whether every soldier who packed garlic into a wound fully understood the chemistry behind it is beside the point. What matters is the continuity. The same plant that ancient Egyptian physicians prescribed for infection, that Eastern European villagers hung in doorways against disease they could not name, that Pasteur finally subjected to controlled laboratory testing, ended up doing functionally the same job, treating wounds when nothing better was available across roughly 3,500 years of recorded human history. Few crops in the modern grocery store can claim a medical resume that long or that consistent, and fewer still can claim it was still actively being used exactly that way within living memory. Inside a war some of your own grandparents may have lived through. But garlic's story is not only one of medicine and mysticism. It has a genuinely dark chapter too, and it plays out not in ancient Egypt or medieval Europe, but in 20th century California, in a small town most people now associate only with a summer food festival. In 1919, a Japanese immigrant named Kiyoshi Hirosaki, having arrived in the United States at the age of 14 and worked for years as a farm laborer, founded Hirosaki Farms in Gilroy, California, a region with dry summers and rich soil that turned out to be almost perfectly suited to garlic cultivation. By the early 1920s, he had shifted his operation almost entirely to garlic, and over the following 2 decades, he expanded it, purchasing more than 1,600 acres of land, despite discriminatory laws of the period that barred many Japanese immigrants from owning property outright. By 1940, Kiyoshi Hirosaki, known locally as the Garlic King, had built the single largest garlic growing operation in the entire United States, almost single-handedly transforming Gilroy from an ordinary farming town into what would eventually be marketed as the garlic capital of the world. He employed local workers, funded community institutions, and helped build a Japanese community center in the town he had helped put on the map. Then came December 7, 1941, and the attack on Pearl Harbor. Here is the uncomfortable reality that does not make it into most food histories at all. Within weeks, federal agents arrested Kiyoshi Hirosaki. He was sent first to a nearby detention facility, and then transferred to an internment camp in Bismarck, North Dakota. Held not because of anything he had done, but because of his ancestry alone. His family, including 8 children, was forced to relocate to Colorado. Across the West Coast, roughly 120,000 people of Japanese descent, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens, were removed from their homes and incarcerated under a policy driven by wartime hysteria, and historians have since documented, encouraged in no small part by competing agricultural interests eager to seize the farmland Japanese-American growers had spent decades building. Japanese-American farmers had come to produce roughly 40% of California's commercial vegetable crop by the start of the war. 40%. And almost overnight, the government dismantled that entire productive class, seizing land, freezing careers, and interning families, including the man who had built America's single largest garlic farm from almost nothing. Hirosaki was not enslaved, and his story is not the story of chattel slavery that runs through the history of crops like sugar or cotton, and it deserves to be told with that distinction intact. But it is a story of a government using the machinery of the state to strip a productive, successful immigrant farmer of his freedom and his land, specifically because of who he was. A pattern that recurs throughout the history of American agriculture, and that garlic, of all crops, happens to sit directly inside. Kiyoshi Hirosaki survived the war. In 1945, his family returned to Gilroy and resumed growing garlic on the land they had fought to keep. He rebuilt what he could, remained active in the local Japanese community, and continued farming until his death in 1963. The industry he helped found did not disappear.
It grew larger than ever, eventually giving rise to the Gilroy Garlic Festival, first held in 1979, which today draws well over 100,000 visitors in a typical year and has raised millions of dollars for local charities. The man most responsible for putting garlic on that map spent part of the 1940s behind barbed wire for the crime of his heritage. That contradiction, a town built on garlic celebrating its harvest today, largely without widespread public awareness of the internment that shaped its own origin story, is not something to joke about. And it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving on. The mechanization and expansion of garlic farming through the mid-20th century followed a familiar industrial pattern, driven less by any single dramatic invention and more by irrigation technology, mechanized planting and harvesting equipment, and the rise of California's Central Valley as one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. Garlic, once a crop harvested entirely by hand, clove by clove, bulb by bulb, became something that could be planted, irrigated, harvested, and processed at a scale nobody in ancient Egypt or medieval Europe could have imagined, dehydrated into powder, minced into jars, pressed into paste, and shipped globally within days of harvest.
None of that scale existed by accident. It took decades of infrastructure most people never think about when they reach for a bulb at the grocery store. Dedicated irrigation canals pulling water across California's dry Central Valley summers. Refrigerated rail cars capable of moving harvested crops across an entire continent before they spoiled. And a processing industry that grew up specifically to turn raw bulbs into powder, flakes, paste, and oil at a scale no kitchen could ever match. Gilroy itself built its identity almost entirely around this industrial transformation, home for decades to one of the largest garlic processing plants in the world, filling the air of the town with a smell so distinctive that longtime residents describe being able to tell just by stepping outside whether the plant was running a heavy shift that day. And that industrial scale set the stage for garlic's genuinely global modern era, one dominated overwhelmingly by a single country. China now produces roughly 75 to 80% of the entire world's garlic supply, harvesting somewhere in the range of 20 million metric tons annually, an amount so large it dwarfs every other producing nation combined. India, ranked a distant second, produces only a small fraction of that total, followed by countries including Bangladesh, South Korea, and the United States. With California's Central Valley, largely built on the foundation growers like Hirosaki laid decades earlier, still supplying the vast majority of America's domestic garlic. The global garlic market is valued today in the billions of dollars, and that dominance by a single producing country has caused genuine friction. In the United States, anti-dumping tariffs on Chinese garlic have existed since the 1990s, and in recent years, federal investigators have prosecuted importers for mislabeling shipments of Chinese garlic as other vegetables, including one widely reported case involving garlic disguised as fresh ginger, specifically to dodge tariffs meant to protect domestic growers descended from exactly the industry Hirosaki built. Here is the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Garlic smuggling, complete with false paperwork, mislabeled shipping containers, and multi-million-dollar fraud investigations, is a real, ongoing feature of 21st century international trade. A bulb that once cost workers a labor strike in ancient Egypt is still, thousands of years later, valuable enough to smuggle. But garlic is far more than just food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Researchers have spent decades studying allicin and its related sulfur compounds for potential effects on cardiovascular health, blood pressure, and cholesterol, with results that remain genuinely mixed and are still actively debated within the scientific community, not the kind of settled miracle cure story that supplement marketing often implies.
Black garlic, made by slowly fermenting whole bulbs that controlled heat and humidity over several weeks until the cloves turn a deep, almost tar-black color and develop a flavor closer to balsamic vinegar or molasses than raw garlic, has become a genuine culinary trend in high-end restaurants over the past 2 decades, commanding prices per pound that would have seemed absurd for a vegetable even a generation ago.
And in an even stranger twist, agricultural researchers, including teams working with organizations studying long-duration space travel, have investigated garlic as a candidate crop for future missions, valued precisely because of its long shelf life, minimal water requirements, and concentrated nutritional and antimicrobial properties, the very same qualities that made it valuable to Bronze Age traders moving along mountain passes in Central Asia 6,000 years ago. The plant that fed pyramid laborers on the Nile is now being seriously considered as a candidate to feed astronauts on Mars. And the sheer scale of ordinary, everyday consumption is easy to lose sight of, because none of it feels dramatic in the moment. South Korea, a country of roughly 52 million people, has one of the highest per capita garlic consumption rates on the planet, with average intake for a single person running into the range of several kilograms a year, woven into kimchi, marinades, and stews eaten at nearly every meal. In parts of the Mediterranean and Central Asia, garlic consumption remains just as embedded, so routine that nobody stops to think of it as remarkable at all, in exactly the same way nobody in ancient Egypt would have described onions and garlic as exotic. It is worth pausing on that because it is the same pattern the entire history of this bulb keeps returning to. Something so common it becomes invisible, right up until you actually trace where it came from. It was there when the first foragers in Central Asia decided a wild, sharp-tasting bulb was worth eating instead of avoiding. It was there in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, sealed away for the afterlife. It was there when hungry workers walked off a royal job site more than 3,000 years ago and staged history's earliest recorded strike. It was there in the diets of Greek athletes and Roman soldiers, in Ayurvedic remedies in Chinese kitchens, hung above doorways across Eastern Europe to guard against evil nobody could explain. It was there in Louis Pasteur's laboratory, and it was there in open battlefield wounds when penicillin ran out. It was there when a Japanese immigrant built the largest garlic farm in America, and it was there, growing in the fields he was forced to leave behind, when the United States government stripped him of his freedom for no reason beyond his ancestry. And it is there right now, in your kitchen, in a mesh bag or a small woven basket, costing you a few dollars for a bulb that took roughly 6,000 years, several empires, at least one labor uprising, 1 world war's worth of makeshift medicine, and 1 deeply unjust internment to arrive in front of you exactly as it is. Garlic was never just a seasoning. It never was. Not bad for a lumpy, sharp-smelling bulb that ancient aristocrats would not touch. If any part of this history surprised you, let me know in the comments which one. And if you want more stories like this, the everyday things in your kitchen that turn out to have far stranger past than anyone tells you, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.